make sure this is working. And let's see. Looks good. How's the sound? Let's see. I guess I can get rid of that. Alright. Looks good. How's the sound? Oh, wait a minute. Had to kill the desktop audio. Hold on, I'm just checking the sound here. Yeah, because there's going to be a little echo. Alright, sounds pretty good. Let me make sure. Yeah. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to get into this is the last part of the pre-flop section. It is a long one, though. This is like 8 parts to this because it's short stack play. And the thing about this to know is, I think everybody knows that when you're on when everybody's on a short stack, meaning 20 big blinds and less, that's where the most money in the tournaments are made. So obviously it's going to be a very in-depth section. So we're not going to come close to finishing this today. I'm going to go till like about 1 o'clock, which is about an hour and 25 minutes, something like that. And then I have a couple errands to run. Then we're going to play Cash NWSOP because we're closing in on finishing out the challenge, hopefully getting to $1,000 today. So I'm going to try to put in a lot of time. I'm not going to try to force it, but if we can finish it today, that'd be great. So going to be a lot of streaming today, hopefully. Maybe it'll take 10 minutes. You never know. I've gone on crazy runs. But let's go ahead and get this started. And here we go. Oh, hang on.
Every major scenario you are going to be in on the flop. Let's now discuss adjustments based on your stack depth. And let's discuss as we get shallower. If you want discussion on deeper stacked play, check out the Cash Game Masterclass at pokercoaching.com in the Courses tab, and that will help you learn how to play.
That's what we're going through next, the Cash Game Masterclass after this one. I looked at the material after this. Surprisingly, it's not anywhere near as much as up to here. We're not through half the thing, but the section's just broken down a lot smaller, so I don't think it's going to take as long to get through it as I originally thought.
When you're very deep stacked. But usually in tournaments, you're playing somewhere between like 60 big blinds deep and 10 big blinds deep. So we really want to focus on shallow stacked play. So we have a whole section here devoted to playing relatively short stacked. So with roughly 20 big blinds, let's go through some common adjustments you should make. Recognize that as the stack to pot ratio decreases, almost everything we've discussed so far when we've been playing slightly deeper stacked, 40 big blinds deep, that still applies, although there are a few key differences. First, ranges are going to change because whenever you are shorter than 20 big blinds, very often you are going to be incentivized to go all in with some of your hands pre-flop that you would not be incentivized to go all in with when you were deeper stacked. When you are continuation betting, you should very often use smaller sizes, but with the same frequencies as before. And you should also consider geometric bet sizing, which I'll discuss in just a second. When you're facing bets, you're going to find that you want to raise more often from out of position, especially with hands that are strong but vulnerable. We saw this a little bit when we were looking at 4-bet pots, when we were deeper stacked, and where you're just like ripping it in with any hand that has decent equity. Same thing in 3-bet pots. And it's similar here, where when you have a hand that has decent equity but doesn't mind protection, you're often just going to be shoving all in because the pot's already pretty big. And finally, you're going to slow play your premium hands even more because you don't need to raise to build the pot. So let's discuss pre-flop ranges very briefly. At 15 big blinds deep, you should expect some pre-flop hands in your initial raising range to no longer be there because you will have shoved them all in. For example, let's take a look at the low jack range, right? Here's low jack range, 40 big blinds deep, nice and standard, nothing to see here. But when we're playing 15 big blinds deep, notice these hands in blue opt to open shove all in. They fold you in the low jack, you're going all in with these hands instead of min raising them. And therefore, they're no longer in your range going to the flop.
See, and this goes to the concept of card removal. Like you see, there's ace-9, so we're taking an ace out of the deck. King-10, king-jack, queen-jack suited, 10-jack suited. Like the Broadway hands that are suited have enough equity on their own, and the king-jack and king-10 where they can be good. You're not going to get dominated too much because remember, you only have the cutoff, or what is it, the cut off the button and the blinds to get through. So we're looking for top tier, like 50% hands. You just jam over the top, but this is one of those things where, if you raise the ace-9 and get called and hit an ace, it's like you really can't fold, but at the same time, you can't love it, because how do you get the money in versus a hand that you beat? Whereas, if you just jam it pre-flop, you're going to see calls from hands like king-queen, you're going to see calls from just a lot of hands that you have beat at that moment, and that's sometimes what it comes down to. I also like that it included the ace-queen off and the ace-jack off. The ace-queen off especially are ones that people tend to overvalue. This is probably your best case scenario for a jam, is your ace-king and king-queen off, because you're going to get called by hands you just dominate the shit out of. The amount of times people are going to roll over ace-10 in the small blind, or a suited ace-8 or something like that, it's really the hands that make your tournament. So I love those shoves being included in here. The king-queen off as well, kind of the same thing. The ace-jack's a little different for me, because I do believe there is a way to raise and get called and get the money in with that ace and be good. But then again, that's kind of a lot of guesswork. Usually that's a final table thing. I think just as a standard, open rip when you're in the money, but, you're not nearing the final table, I think the ace-jack off is absolutely in my rip range at 50 big blinds or less from the low jack. I'd like to think so, though. I don't consider my low jack range that much as for open ripping, because as you can see, there aren't that many hands. But if you look at it, the king-9, queen-9, I mean, like the little fringe hands, the ace-8 off, all those little hands, they really just can't enter your play anymore. Yeah, the 10-9 suited is there. I like it. I guess the 9-8 suited and 10-8 suited being a dividing line I should pay more attention to, but I don't even think I would consider the 10-8. I think the 9-8 I would consider, but that's about it. I like just not even playing the threes, deuces, and fours. I think that came up in the last tournament stream. In the tournament I got second in, I open folded fours in the, I believe it was the cutoff. It might have been the low jack. It might have, I'm not sure, but either way, it was just one of those ones where normally you're playing this hand under the gun, pocket fives, but, or pocket fours, you're playing, under the gun +1 with 60 big blinds. You can't even open it, even in this late-ass position. Maybe from the cutoff occasionally you can rip it, but it's just interesting to see how the breakdowns come.
Also, say someone raises the cutoff and you're on the button. There, you're going to be jamming a lot of your ace-x offsuit type hands, whereas you would never jam them 40 big blinds deep. So since you're not jamming them 40 big blinds deep, that means the button flat calling range and the button 3-betting range are going to be very different as we are deeper stacked, which leads to some pretty interesting looking solver solutions, which we're going to be going through a lot coming soon. Next, you're going to find that due to the shallow stack to pot ratio, when you do continuation bet, you're going to be using smaller sizes, but at similar frequencies to when you were deeper stacked. So you're still going to be betting roughly the same frequency, but with smaller sizes. Good example of this, exact same spot, under the gun +1 against big blind on ace-jack 5. In this scenario, 40 big blinds deep, we already studied this. You see you're betting using a 2/3 or 1/3 pot size bet with roughly a 50-50 mix, checking basically never, okay? However, 20 big blinds deep, still basically checking never, but we're using the 1/3 pot size bet more often. And that's because we don't need to bet to build the pot here. And the opponent's going to be in pretty bad shape, right? So we have a big equity and range advantage. Instead of betting big roughly half the time, now we're betting big only roughly a third of the time. And this kind of pattern is going to hold true. We're going to go through a lot of these.
The concept here is you're trying to reduce the stack to pot ratio at 40 big blinds or more in this situation, and at 20 big blinds or more, you really don't need to, because if any more money goes in the pot, it's going to be pretty easy to get all the money in. So, if you make a raise and somebody calls, there's about 6 blinds in the pot because of the blinds and antes, and then, you bet 1/3 pot, it's only like 2, maybe 2 1/4 blinds, but if that even gets called, you've got 10 blinds in there, and you've only got 16 left, because you've put 4 in. So it's pretty easy to just get the money in. I mean, even on the turn, this is one where I get paid off a lot with the ace-king in this scenario, where I'll make that small bet on the flop, and then on the turn, make another equally small bet, so something around 4, maybe 5 big blinds, probably like 4.5. At that point, if the player's going to continue, they just jam on you, and then you snap. And the amount of times I've seen players roll over second pair or a worse ace is kind of amazing. And those are the kind of pots that take you so much further, because they're not exactly traps where you're checking, but they're traps where you're kind of like, this is something I say all the time, is I'm playing this hand like jokers. Because there's literally, after I've seen a certain flops, there is no point in me ever folding, because I would be looking for the statistical anomaly where I am beat, and it's a good idea to fold. And you don't have to have the nuts for that. You know, you raise, you get called pre-flop, the flop comes off ace jack 5, you have ace king. I mean, it's a statistical anomaly that somebody has ace jack 5s, jack 5, or jacks, because jacks would have 3-bet you. And if we're talking about being from under the gun versus the big blind, you know, the ace jack is probably the most likely scenario. But with 20 big blinds, you know, effective, meaning the big blind player has 20 big blinds as well. Pocket fives can often jam. Jacks will definitely 3-bet. People who think jacks won't 3-bet, it's kind of crazy. It's one of those things that I know is a common thing that I don't do often, just because of these scenarios and because sometimes I want to see the safe flop. That's what you see more than anything. The safe flop people. But other than those two very specific situations, we're talking about a scenario where if we bet the flop and get called, somebody's usually on some kind of draw, and if the turn comes off like deuce of clubs, you know, safe for us, we're just better off betting a third of the pot, because that will tell people that we like our hand, but people will look for reasons to try to push you off. So if the big blind calls and you bet a third of the pot, and then he checks the turn and you bet a third again, be surprised how many times people will then, or even when that safe turn comes off, they'll either open rip it into you, like for this over bet of, you know, 16 big blinds effective into a 10 big blind pot, which I've seen people do a lot when they have the spade draw and the turn bricks for them. It's a interesting power move, because they still have all the equity, but they don't want it to go check, or they don't want it to just get bet at again, where now they can't fold, so they'll just jam, hoping that pushes you out of a good situation for yourself. So other than that, you're going to see people when they check and you bet, they're going to go ahead and rip it on you with a lot of hands, where they're going to be like, well, if I call this, I really can't fold the river, which is just absolutely not true. But people still do think that way. So it's one of those things when you don't have to reduce the stack to pot ratio. You can just go, well, this is jokers. We're just going to play it like we're never folding here. And I don't think you should be looking to fold those spots. I mean, the one quote that everybody has about Stu Unger when they talked about his game, well, Doyle Brunson famously said Stewie was an amazing player, but he never made a great fold, and had an amazing amount of tournament success because he understood the concept that not folding in certain high-pressure situations is usually just, you know, the monsters under the bed. So I think it's one of those things where if you do well and you keep your head on you, I think you can get paid off a lot easier than you think you can. People think you have to like bet big on this flop. You just don't. With 20 big blinds, you just don't.
So we will be able to see a lot of differences as we move forward. Also, geometric bet sizing is important.
My favorite
geometric
concepts.
bet sizing is strategically sizing your bets in a manner that allow you to go all in by a particular betting round while keeping the bet sizes roughly the same percentage across all streets. And this is nice because it allows you to either make your opponent think that they cannot fold because of good pot odds, or you could kind of flip this on its head and use perhaps a small size on the flop and then a huge size on the turn and make your opponent think that they can't call because your bet's too big, and that can allow you to manipulate your opponent's...
That's the most common way that you'll see geometric bet sizing used. Personally, for bets, I kind of go smaller on the flop, bigger on the turn, biggest on the river. And this sliding scale, like where people don't like to call bets multiple rounds of betting. So, you know, if you bet small on the flop and bet bigger on the turn, they're already having to call you twice, which people don't like. And then, you know, the bet is even bigger. That puts a lot of pressure on. And then, you know, that's how you see those ones where you get to jam the river for a pot-sized bet because you've orchestrated it. And this works the same with bluffs as it does with value hands. Value hands, you may bet a little bigger on the flop and make the turn bet smaller and the river bet smaller percentage-wise. But going for that bet typical scenario, It's like a third on the flop, like 2/3 on the turn. And then by that time, if you started out with, 40 or 50 blinds, the river you can jam, and it's a pot-sized bet. And it just looks like it's the only bet you can make with a value hand if you have a pot behind, is a pot-sized bet. And people will see that and go, shit, that's really strong. And they'll just fold. And you'd be amazed how many times you get that fold there. And it's one of those things that sounds scary. When I originally first saw this section, I rewatched this in particular part about geometric bet sizing. It had to have been 10 times that day. I just left it on the computer, and I would watch it. I had a little notepad, make notes, and then I walked away, and then I did a bunch of other stuff, and then I came back, and I literally rewatched it, this one little section again, and, updated some notes, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And I really went through it, and then that night, I played a tournament, and like the third hand of this tournament that I played, I had one where I'm like, oh, this is a bet. So let's do it. And I had never done it before, ever. And this is only like a year ago. I'd never done it before. I'd seen guys do it before, but I didn't understand the concept behind it. And I really studied it hard, and it worked. And I ended up coming in third in that tournament, I believe, which was great because I really needed it. But yeah, so this hasn't been in my repertoire that long, but I'm very comfortable with it now. And watching Jonathan Little play, if he has some of his old stuff on YouTube, you see him using this bet perfectly, and his mind works so quickly because he's done it thousands upon thousands of times that you really do get the game flow of it. So I would recommend that too when you're learning how to do that for bluffing.
And to doing what you'd like them to do. For example, on the flop, let's say the pot is 8 big blinds, and you have 20 big blinds and want to get all the money in by the turn using a bet size that gives your opponent roughly the same price on both betting rounds. Well, take a second, figure out how much you have to bet on the flop.
So with 20 big blinds remaining and 8 big blinds in the pot, we're looking to get to the point where we make it easy. You got to remember, you multiply the bet by 2. So let's say we bet 4 blinds here, half pot, right? I'm going to go down to 16 blinds. My opponent's going to call, put his 4 in. 4 plus 4 is 8, plus 8 in the middle. Well, look at that. We got 16 blinds left. We can get it all in by the turn. But you want the same approximate bet size. So we're talking about getting it in with the same percentage. So we can definitely do that and make it a pot size bet on the turn, which is good. There's a lot of top pair hands that are vulnerable that you want to do that with. But let's say we bet 6 big blinds, right, on this flop. That would put 20 in the pot, and then we'd have 14 left, so that's a little bit much. 5 big blinds. That would leave us with 15 and put 18 in the pot, yeah. Oh, wait a minute. If I put in 4, 4, and 16, yeah, so it's a percentage thing. So if I bet 5 big blinds on this flop, and we got 18 in there, and I've got 15 left, I think that's the answer. 5 big blinds on the flop, and then just all in on the turn gets you the same percentage because it's you'll have 15 going into 18. You had 5 going into 8. Yeah, that sounds about right.
To be able to make the same percentage bet on the turn. Go ahead, pause the video, think about it. Well, essentially, let's say you bet 6 big blinds on the flop. The pot's going to have 12 big blinds added to it. You're 6, your opponent's 6. So the pot's going to go up to 20, and you're going to have 14 left. So you made a 3/4 pot bet on the turn, and you're going to have about a 2/3 pot size bet on the river. And that's often going to result.
See, for me, that's a little bit high. I think 5 was right. I think 5 big blinds, because that's about 60% on the flop, right? And that would put 18 in there. And then 60% on the turn would be... like 9, 10, 11, 12? Yeah, so I think it's closer with 5 and then the turn jam. But we'll
your opponent's feeling somewhat inclined to call because they're getting reasonable odds on both betting rounds. But let's say instead you bet 2 big blinds on the flop or 3 big blinds on the flop. Let's say you bet 3 and your opponent calls. They're going to call that 3 big blind bet very frequently. Pot's going to go up to, 14 big blinds, and you're going to have 17 left. So now you can make a slight overbet on the turn if you want to make a big bet and scare your opponent out of the pot with all but their best hands. This is a very strong strategy that will allow you to get called when you want to get called and get folds when you want your opponent to fold if you're playing against non-game theory optimal opponents. Next, you want to deny equity when you are facing bets. When you're short stacked, you're going to find that you often want to choose to just rip it all in with your strong but non-nut hands in an attempt to deny your opponent equity. And also with some draws too to balance. So let's take a look at this spot. 40 big blinds deep, button versus big blind against a 33% pot bet. So big blind checks, button bet small, back to the big blind. You see the big blind is raising with the hands in red 20% of the time. 15 big blinds deep though, same scenario. The button's now raising all in 31% of the time. So it's raising more often and using this.
And this is that thing that I talk about with, where to trap and where to jam. Because the sheer size of the bet can elevate the value of your hand. So like Jack 10 off, not a great hand, but when you open rip it, it's very hard for people to have cards that are left. Like even Ace Jack doesn't love that if you're both on like 15 or whatever big blinds. So it's just one of those things where the big move is usually better. You just need some removal. Ace 6, King 6, Jack 9 suited just for its overall value, usually going to get a 60-40. Worst case scenario. The Ace 6 suited is interesting because I would rather sub this Ace 5 suited in and leave the Ace 6 as a call, but it is a worse hand, so maybe that's why you're jamming.
Bigger protection size. And let's take a look at some of the hands that opt to raise all in. Like King 6 for middle pair is happy to get it all in. 6-5 for middle pair is happy to get it all in. Any Jack, right? These are all getting it all in. Look at a few sporadic bluffs, like we see King Queen suited every once in a while. Look at Queen 9 suited, right? Queen 10 suited, Queen 8 offsuit, Queen 10 offsuit. These are essentially the draws in this scenario that are opting to jam. We see all these gut shots down here are just ripping it in.
And this is usually when the pot is small. Like you've raised pre-flop to 2, somebody's called, there's 6 in the middle, and you're talking about an overbet for 15 big blinds.
So kind of interesting to see this, right? That these hands that are pretty junky are being used as bluffs, as well as hands like King 6 being used as a value hand. Also notice the kind of odd pre-flop strategy. That's because pre-flop, the big blind's shoving all in with these hands that are not played, like Ace, Queen offsuit, pocket jacks, etc. All these hands shove pre-flop, which leaves a rather odd-looking post-flop strategy. Notice that's a little bit different than this strategy here, which is way more mixed, right? Where like most hands are still in the range. Okay, so realize that when we're shallower, you're just going to be getting it in a little bit wider for value, which also allows you to bluff a little bit more often too. So don't be afraid to rip it in there. Finally, let's discuss slow playing. At a shallow stack to pot ratio, you should slow play your nut hands more often for the following reasons. First, it's easy to get all in by the river if you feel inclined, because you don't have to get much more money in the pot. Next, you're not afraid of being outdrawn. So many people are deathly afraid of getting outdrawn at any stack size, but realize if your opponent has a good draw, they're not going to fold anyway. And if they do have a random junky draw, it would not have paid you off if you bet. But if you check, it will at least consider bluffing. Now, if your opponent's just a weak, tight-knit who's never going to bluff if you check, then maybe you do still want to go ahead and bet the nuts. But against a good, strong, reasonable opponent, if they're going to be sitting there with a junky draw, they're going to consider betting it, and that just gives you additional equity that you are going to be in great shape to collect. So you always want to give your opponent a chance to bluff, or, as we see here, number 3, catch up to a stronger hand.
This has come up a lot in the cash games lately, and it's paid off so immensely, where I raise a hand that's reasonable, and I bet it for value twice and then check the river. And I'm literally saying it every time. I said, I think here we can go ahead and check. Usually this is like I'm in position against the big blind, right? So, raising something like Ace 10 or Ace Jack in the cutoff, big blind or small blind calls, and then the flop comes off with an ace on it, and they check. And there's usually some kind of draw, like a flush draw or a straight draw or something. Betting the standard bet for value and protection of, about, 40%, maybe 50% pot, and then they call, and then the turn comes off, and it's, a blank, and going ahead and betting again, and maybe getting a little bit extra, maybe about 55, 60%. Now, they're still making a mistake by drawing for that one card, right? Now, here's the thing. You kind of have to allow the flush draw to take a card on the flop, because if you bet too big, that you're just never going to play against you, or you're going to get jammed on by flush draws, and then you have to fold your marginals, right? So betting a little bit smaller on the flop is better. And then if a bad card comes off, you can just check. You know what I'm saying? You can just check behind, and then, if they bet the river, you can decide whether or not to call. That's that. But when a blank comes on the turn, betting a little bit more, about 55 or 60%, just my standard value and protection. I've made the bet that I know makes it incorrect for this player to draw to a shitty draw, like an open-ender or a flush draw that's not the nuts with no overs. It's kind of a shitty draw. They're only going to hit it about a third of the time. I've bet about 55% pot. I'm not offering them the correct odds. So therefore, when they call, the river comes off and it's a brick, right? This is usually a good move. I said the positions backwards. This is usually a good move, like when I'm in the cutoff and the other player is under the gun +2, or they had limped or something like that. For whatever reason, I can check to them on the river, right? And I'll say, I'm just going to go ahead and check on the river here and go ahead and let them go ahead and bluff. Sometimes you're from the small blind, whatever. And then they go, and then you check it, and then you'd be amazed how many times people will just try to bluff because they know they can't win. Like, they just know that their hand does not win. And you'll see a lot of large bets come in on the river of 2/3 pot or more, sometimes an over bet. I've snap called so many of these in the last week, and it's just been worth so much value allowing the player a chance to bluff. Because what is the point of betting the river? They're not going to call you with a worse hand, but every hand that wants to bluff needs you to give them an opportunity to. And especially when the player only has like 40 blinds left playing cash, they've put in 60 on this draw, you're going to see them just chuck that last 40 in as a shot. And then, you're just going to keep rolling over top pair on them. And people will convince themselves that you're wrong for calling there. People will actually say, oh, you should never call that with ace-10. Meanwhile, I had no reason to ever believe I was ever beat, things like that. So those are the nice scenarios of betting. Checking is when you have to have a much stronger hand, obviously. He's going to talk about that now.
Let's say you are in position and it goes check, check, and your opponent has like random queen high. If they turn a queen, they're going to be thrilled, and they're going to put their money in the pot, right? So you're going to find that the reward for essentially letting your opponent catch up to a second best hand is much larger to some extent when you're playing shallow stack, because, like, say your opponent does catch up to a marginal one pair hand playing deep stacked.
This is an interesting scenario. He's going to talk about the opposite effect, but last night there was a hand with a player who I have been raising and re-raising a lot. He just was the unlucky guy that had reasonable hands, and then I had better hands. And it's just one of those things you have to recognize. And I realized he was boiling over the top. So he had made a raise under the gun, and I 3-bet from the button, and he just called it. The flop came off like 4-4 deuce. He checked, and I bet super small. I bet like less than a third pot. He called it. The turn came off a king. He checked. I bet super small again. He raised monstrously, about 80% of his stack. I went all in for the extra change. He sat there and let his time tick and realized, oh shit, I'm beat. But called it anyway with ace-king, and I just rolled over the aces. This is that kind of scenario he's talking about where the player goes, gotcha, and they just freak out. Like, letting someone hit a pair sometimes is the best thing in the world. Now, can they beat you if you have a bigger pair? Yeah. But they still have to catch a second pair, you know what I'm saying? So you have to be willing to put that little bit of bluff in and realize that when the money goes in, if you're a 90% favorite, you do that over and over and over again, you're going to die rich. So
not that big of a deal. They're still not going to pay you off for a lot of money. But when they're shallow, they realize, all right, well, got my pair now. I have to be willing to get it in. And that's going to result in you stacking them for their relatively shallow stack. So examples of hands that slow play on most boards, usually just the very good hands.
This is at
top
20 big
sets,
blinds.
straights, flushes, top two pair. You don't necessarily want to be slow playing stuff like top pair, top kicker, because that hand is often sometimes susceptible to being outdrawn. But with your very strong, effective nut hands, those are the hands you do want to at least consider slow playing. And we're going to go through a bunch of examples to take a...
There are some spots where you're going to slow play the top pair. The ace-king when you just open and you have 12 blinds or something like that, instead of jamming, because it is a premium ace-king suited, let's say, and you flop the ace, you might very well just slow play this because there's literally no reason for you to ever fold unless the board comes out just super bad. That's one that I'll check the flop on a lot, bet small on the turn, and the guy ends up jamming on me with second pair. But other than that specific situation, he's right, two pair or better, really, and it's top two pair or better. Anything, middle and bottom pair or top and bottom pair, you want to play a little faster because that your hand can get counterfeited. If somebody has ace-king and you have ace-10, and you flop, or somebody has ace-king and you have ace-8, and the flop comes off, ace-9-8. You know what I'm saying? And then they bet and you just call and the turn comes off a 9. Now your hand's counterfeited. You know what I'm saying? So you want to be fast playing those, getting the money in as quickly as possible. And so that when that hand misses, you get paid all the way off, you know.
Take a look at this. So these are the main differences. I do want to make sure we reiterate these because these are very, very important. Because really, not a lot changes, but at the same time, these 5 factors will impact your strategy a decent amount, and you want to make sure that you are applying them accordingly. Let's briefly discuss how to play as the preflop raiser when check 2. And again, you should use this flowchart you should be very familiar with by now. Overall, your strategy of whether to bet or not should not really change all that much compared to when you were playing 40 big blinds deep. And overall, the frequencies remain almost identical, which is nice. The main differences here is that your sizing should generally just be lower, again, due to the shorter stack to pot ratio. Your small bet should be something like 30% pot or less, and now a large bet is going to be closer to 50% pot. You're not going to be betting 2/3 or 3/4 pot in this scenario, just because stack to pot ratio is short. When that's the case, your bet sizes shrink across the board. All right, let's take a look at some examples.
You just don't have as much to get in the pot, so you make it easier on yourself. Let's do the quiz. As stack to pot ratio decreases below 6, which of the following is true? Pre-flop ranges generally stay the same. That's not true. You should c-bet with the same frequency. Well, that's true. Premium hands should usually be slow played more often. Yeah, I would say that's true. The pre-flop ranges have to change wildly because it's the way I always think about it is this. There were these old guys that used to play at Bill's Gambling Hall when I bet or when I dealt there. And what they would do is everybody would be buying in with 250 to 300, right? Then these old guys would come in for the promos and the free coffee, and they were nice guys, but you know, they weren't really like players. They were just kind of doing the thing. They were playing the aces cracked promo, you know what I'm saying? So if they got aces and they got cracked, you get a rack, so you get $100. So what they would do is they would buy in with $50, and they were there to just try to grind out, you know, $20, $30 profit a day. That's it. These were guys on a fixed income and all like that. So what they would do is they would basically just play super rock tight and only get all the money in with aces at any time. Because for them, it was a no-lose proposition. Because if they got the aces cracked, well, they got a rack. You know what I'm saying? They got $100, so they profited 50 immediately. If they got the money in with the aces and they won, you know, they usually won more than $50 because they got doubled up plus whatever else was in the pot, blinds and antes, all that kind of shit. But as the stack to pot ratio decreases, so they're on $50, which is 25 blinds, right? It was the dead minimum. So you'd see these guys just calling with just an amazing amount of hands that you would never just call with preflop. You know, obviously all pairs, good stuff like that. They really didn't protect anything, and it's because they realized the money was going to go in so often, they didn't need to. So what they would do is they would see cheap flops, make top pair, and get the money in. And then, you know, if they won, great. If they didn't, they would just pull out another 50 and go from there. They didn't need to define their hand. And it's a horrible way to play a cash game, but I was able to learn something about what they were doing in tournaments by adjusting my pre-flop ranges and taking more of that joker approach. You know what I'm saying? So it was an interesting thing that I learned from bad players that I was able to incorporate in my later tournament career. When you drop to 15 big blinds, hands like ace-9, ace-queen off, and king-queen off, and 5-5 may not be in the pre-flop range charts because you would go all in pre-flop. Very true. Yeah, those are jammers. As strict stack to pot ratio goes down, what happens to your flop bet sizes? Well, they go down as well because you have less to get in. You got 20 blinds, you bet 2, that's kind of significant. You don't need to bet 4 or 5 blinds. It's fine. Stack to pot ratio goes down. Should you check raise all in more often when facing a bet? That's interesting because I believe, well, it's kind of a blanket statement, but you're not going to be check raising that much. You're going to be just betting. But then again, if you're, no, because you're opening, no. So I'm guessing the answer is no. I don't know what we're going for here. Wrong. As shallower stack, you should be willing to get, oh, okay, so it's just a concept of should you be more willing to get the money in? Yes, you should. So I guess check raising is the most effective way of getting the money in on a short stack is what we're going for here. I don't know if that's always true, but I guess as a blanket statement, this is okay if you flop well, out of position, you're in the blind or something, you flop 2 pair, whatever, check raising, sure. Okay, I don't get the phrasing, but I agree with the sentiment. That's fine. Okay, we're going to mark this as complete. We'll go on to the next section. Good to see we're getting some people in here. I appreciate you guys. This is the fun stuff. The interesting little study stuff that comes in the morning. There is no delay on this stream, so feel free to ask questions.
Now let's take a look at a bunch of examples of how to play as the preflop raiser when you're 20 big blinds deep.
This is the fun stuff. These kind of sections I love because it's like we're playing.
And we're going to be comparing the GTO strategy 20 big blinds deep to the GTO strategy 40 big blinds deep. And we're going to look at some general adjustments and things you should tinker with. And we're going to be essentially seeing what actually changes. I know we're going to go through a lot of spots. These are going to be spots we've already looked at before for the most part, deeper stacked. But it's important to compare and contrast so that you can learn how to play when you are shallower stacked. So let's look at Ace Jack 5. This is the very good flop for the preflop raiser. Under the gun +1 against big blind. As you see, not much changes here. As you see, we are checking only 5% of the time in both examples. 40 big blinds deep compared to 20 big blinds deep. Our equity is roughly the same, right? And the only thing that really changes here is the bet size we are making. Notice that we're using mostly a smaller bet size when we're 20 big blinds deep. So
these are sometimes hard to read for people who don't look at them much. This means we're betting 2/3 of the pot. So we're betting, we're betting 2/3 of the size of the pot. So if there's 6 blinds in the pot, we're betting 4, about 26% of the time. So about 25% of the time, we're betting 2/3 of the pot. Betting 1/3 of the pot, meaning on that 6 big blind pot, we're betting 2 big blinds, the vast majority, almost 70% of the time. And then we're never checking. This 5% bullshit, don't look at that. We're never checking. Whereas if we have 40 big blinds, we're betting 2/3 of the pot almost half the time, and 1/3 of the pot a little bit more often, and obviously there's no checking. So it's interesting because, remember, stack to pot ratio, easier to get the money in the less blinds you have. Makes sense, right? You can charge people the full amount of your stack, but it's not worth as much overall. There's not as many dollars in your stack, let's say. It's different. It's easier to get 20 blinds in the pot than 40, even at a 1-2 game. It's simple.
not really much to see here, but it's actually going to be the case in a lot of these. The only difference is we're just using smaller sizes across the board. Also worth noting here is that preflop ranges are a little bit different. Not a lot different, but a little bit different. And that's just because you're raising slightly different ranges from under the gun +1, 20 big blinds deep compared to 40. Now let's take a look at button versus big blind. Notice now the big blind's range is substantially different. Notice it's missing a lot of these lower suited ace-x, a lot of these middle type hands, and that's because these hands jam it all in preflop. Also missing small pairs. So this is a spot where now...
This is another one that screwed me up for a while. This is when we are on the button, we are versus the big blind. But remember, 20 big blinds is the effective stack, meaning that's what we have or that's what our opponent has. But that's it. That's as big as the pot can get, is 20 big blinds from everybody, you know, who's involved. So there's just the two of us, so there you go. So we're on the button here.
The ranges are going to be a little bit different. But notice, in this scenario, ace-jack 5, it's still quite good for the preflop raiser. So again, checking almost never and betting the vast majority of the time. Interesting spot here where we're actually using a slightly bigger bet size. And that's probably just because our equity advantage is bigger in this scenario. So typically as your equity advantage goes up, you're going to be using larger bet sizes in general, especially on boards that have decent range connectivity. Remember that concept from earlier? Where the opponent's range, when it does connect with the board, is going to connect decently well. And that's usually going to be the case on ace-high and king-high boards that are kind of connected. So notice in the previous scenario, our equity is the same, right? And when your equity is the same, typically you're going to be betting the same size. But as your equity increases, you're usually going to be betting a bigger size as long as your opponent has reasonable range connectivity. Now let's take a look at this out-of-position scenario. When you're out of position playing shallower stacked, quite often you're going to be doing a little bit more checking. And that's because your equity is often going to be a little bit lower. So let's take a look at this scenario. 40 big blinds deep, we check 27%. 20 big blinds deep, we check 58% though. And it makes sense. If you look at the equity of the ranges that play, you see 40 big blinds deep, we have 60% equity. 20 big blinds deep, we have 54% equity. And that's because the button caller's range...
See, and we're talking about where we opened and then the button called. So obviously we're going to check the really monstrous hands, you know, the aces, you know, the kings, things like that. Kings are vulnerable, but aces, jacks, fives aren't even in the range because we're not even opening them under the gun. So it's an unfortunate miss, right? But at the same time, things like ace king, we are going to be betting a large percentage of the time, but we're going to be betting very small. You know what I'm saying? Because on this kind of board, it just favors the pre-flop raisers so much. Like, when this board hits, the guy who raised and got called, and there was no other action pre-flop, it kind of works best for the hands that he would be opening with. There's more aces and jacks and fives and big pairs and things like that. You know what I'm saying? But you can actually go to the theory that you can check so frequently because you're out of position going for check raises. Now, obviously, you're not going to check raise aces or jacks. So you're just going to call there and let the player blow up. But this is the scenario I've seen of check raising the ace king. But it likes to bet 2/3 of the pot with the ace king, which to me is interesting. It's one of those ones that Assassinato talks about a lot, where he says you're better off betting big here because when you and your opponent connect on this board, the ace king is most likely best. You know what I'm saying? Some people are going to have a lot of, from the button, they're going to have a lot of combinations of aces that they're not going to want to give up. And the only two that you're going to really be screwed against is ace jack and ace five, which, ace five obviously is going to get it in, but you're going to have a shit ton of outs against that, and it's enough when you have 20 big blinds. So betting bigger would make more sense. And the ace jack is so rare, you're usually going to get 3-bet or jammed on, with that effective stack. Even though you're under the gun +1, the button will still jam the ace jack quite often. I do it frequently. It's just proper. So unless you've just smashed it with ace jack or ace five or things like that, I like a lot of checking here, but I do like some big lead out with the ace king, ace queen, because you're going to find somebody's going to have ace 10, ace 9, whatever ace that you outkick, and they're just not going to be able to give it up because there's just not enough blinds left to make them fold.
It's going to be just a really strong, condensed range when they're calling 20 big blinds deep because they're going to be shoving some hands pre-flop. So they're going to be lacking some of the weaker hands in their range. So notice we have all of these low connected cards and underpairs that aren't really in great shape. So let's take a look at which hands are bet less often. And if you look at this, really just every hand is kind of bet less often. Aces bet less often, kings less often, queens left often, jacks left often, less often. I can't say left often, less often. You see ace kings bet less often. Let's take a look at ace 8 suited. Ace 8 suited is bet less often. Ace 3 suited less often. Queen 8 suited, don't have it. King 8 suited less often. So really just everything across the board is bet less often. And if you wanted to use the strategy that I've outlined where you're betting your pre-made hands and draws in this scenario, notice though that we're still just betting ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, some gut shots like king queen, king 10, queen 10, and that's about it, right? So the strategy holds true. We are just now betting slightly tighter for value, which forces us to have fewer bluffs. Remember, 40 big blinds deep in the scenario, we were betting a lot of these low backdoor flush draws and whatnot. But 20 big blinds deep, you have to chill out with that a little bit. So essentially, you're not going to be looking for bluffs quite as hard when you are playing 20 big blinds deep. And you're also not going to be going for thin-ish value with stuff like ace 8 suited as often. Okay?
Just because every chip in your stack is so much more valuable, you're going to be averse to taking more risk, basically.
Now let's take a look at jack 6-2. This is under the gun +1 versus big blind. Same story. Equities roughly the same, using generally small bet sizes across the board, 20 big blinds deep, but we were also doing that 40 big blinds deep. So this is a spot where we're going to be betting small in both scenarios. Not much changes there at all. And you're going to find that typically when it's under the gun against big blind, not a lot's going to change because the big blind's range is kind of similar, under the gun's range is kind of similar, and not much changes besides you just bet smaller across the board. But we'll keep going through these examples to show that. Now, button versus big blind. Interesting spot. Notice equities are roughly the same. That said, we're checking a little bit more often as we get shallow stacked, right? And I think that makes logical sense because now there are more hands we just don't want to get check raised off of. Notice when we were deeper stacked, we're betting some hands like ace X, right? Essentially just for value / protection. This is a spot where in reality you can probably just bet everything and it's fine, or close enough to everything. But notice when we're playing 20 big blinds deep, we're not betting these marginal hands quite as often. So as you get shallower, you have to be a little bit more cautious betting your likely best hands, but hands that don't want to get check raised, because if you think about the out-of-position player's response, they're often going to respond by check raising. And you don't want to get check raised here. You want to see a cheap showdown with your hand.
That was that last question that we were talking about with the player. The player can check raise us here with hands as weak as, bottom pair, backdoor flush draw, or even hands, as strong as 2-pair or like gut shots, things like that. Like the 3-4 of spades here on this board can actually check raise and then lead turn and successfully bluff quite often. And with 20 big blinds, if we're going to c-bet, 2 big blinds and they're going to raise to 5, then we're talking about having, so much invested in the pot that we kind of have to want to go with it right there. But it's a great bluff spot because of the removal of draws and the fact that the player is going to be holding those, 3-4s and, 7-8s of diamonds and, like weird things like that, 5-7 of spades, these weird hands that have this crazy, it's like a solver kind of rabbit hole where these hands have so much value, but it's only on the back door that it's very hard to see. And God forbid somebody has a pair and a flush draw or backdoor flush draw, where they have just the ace deuce of clubs, or something where, now they have backdoor flush draws, they have overcards, they have bottom pairs, and you raise pre-flop and if you, lead a standard c-bet, they might go, wait a minute, how often does this fucking guy have a jack? You know what I'm saying? Or queens or kings or aces. And if he doesn't, he's not going to like this. So they'll just check raise you. So checking back can be very strong because that makes the player under the gun with his ace deuce of clubs sit there and go, whoa, whoa, whoa. Why is this guy checking? He took the lead pre-flop. What's going on here? Am I like crushed? Am I like crushed? And then you're going to see them check the turn, especially when their suit comes off. Like if another club comes off, they're going to go, ooh, I don't want to get blown off this draw. They're just going to check it again. And then they check again. And then you check again. And then the river comes off and it's total blank. And they're going to go, well, all right, well, I'll check here. And then you check and your pair of, 5s wins because you didn't get blown off the hand. You know what I'm saying? And it becomes one of those Mexican standoffs where, you're both pointing the gun at each other just waiting for somebody to pull the trigger, but the stakes are too high. Nobody wants to get shot. So once the bang goes off in one gun, it's going to most likely go off in the other. In some situations, it's better just to stand there and wait. And when you have hands with good showdown value, like pocket fives, like ace 8, which honestly does have a lot of showdown value. That's not nothing. Ace high is something. You're going to see a lot of king queens here. King queen of clubs, might check flop, check turn, and then, just check the river. And your ace 8 is going to stand up quite often. So you don't want to get blown off these hands that are essentially showdown hands now that don't have much. You know what I'm saying? You also have backdoor spades yourself here, things like that, or backdoor whatever, because it's suited. So it's an interesting scenario, and I think shallower stacked, you get to get a deeper glimpse into people's minds of their theory and how they feel about busting in the tournament. And the players that are always like smacking and fighting for pots and stuff like that, usually great to do. You'll even see them lose it at certain points. And as long as you maintain the same, if I play the same equal amount of checks versus, c-bets and stuff on the flop, for example, it's very hard for somebody to tell if I am actually good or if I'm fucking with them. You know what I'm saying? So it's just one of those things where there's a lot more draws you don't want to get blown off of, even on this raggedy-ass board where it doesn't seem like you have anything. Ace-8 suited here, the ace-8 of clubs is something. You know what I'm saying? So just don't get blown off your hands too easily.
Hands that are likely to be best. They can easily...
In position when you're checking, and then you just get to see the turn. Fuck it. Right? And if he checks twice, usually you can just float a little bet out there and, take the pot down.
They call a turn bet. So understand that when you are betting in these scenarios, you are going to be more likely to get jammed. When you're more likely to get jammed, you want to make sure you either have easy calls or easy folds. By the way, if you do bet a hand like a 6 here, you're not folding if your opponent jams all in on you, okay? You're going to be calling it off. Notice that some of the junky draws are betting less often, right? Really, junky draws across the board are betting less often. If I was trying to make the strategy where we're betting with 100% frequencies for various hands, I would look to use hands like Queen 10 suited, Queen 10 offsuit, really hands that wrap around the jack that lack showdown value, and also hands that wrap around the queen, so like 9-7 suited, 9-8 suited, 8-7 suited, stuff like 10-8 offsuit, Queen 8 offsuit, stuff like that kind of lack showdown value. but also has like some equity. Because you don't really mind betting queen 8 offsuit, as solver doesn't. Also like king 8 offsuit. You don't mind betting this hand and then getting jammed off of it because it doesn't really fare all that well. If you do bet a hand like ace 3 offsuit and get jammed, you are going to fold, just to be clear. So you have to be a little bit more selective when it comes to betting in scenarios where you are going to get jammed on. Let's take a look at under the gun +1 against button. Again, we're going to be doing more checking across the board because usually our equity is going to decrease across the board. Also, mostly smaller bet sizes used compared to a bigger bet size when we are deeper stacked. And you see just really a lot of checking here. If you look at the hands that are bet, they're very often, again, just going to be the best made hands, right? We see aces, kings, queens, ace jack and king jack and queen jack checks, which is kind of interesting a lot of the time. I mean, they still bet half the time or so, but it's interesting to see they actually do check sometimes. But again, mixed frequencies are going to be used all the time when you're out of position looking at the GTO strategy. Then some like low ace-x suiteds are used as bluffs mostly. Then some hands that wrap around the jack and the jack if we have them, because we don't really have any that wrap around the 6 so much. So you see like queen 10, king 10, queen 9, etc. These are the hands that are opted to use as bluffs. But again, we're not betting very often in this scenario. So kind of a cool thing to see that we are doing a lot of checking out of position when we are 20 big blinds deep. But again, notice we don't really have the equity advantage here. Like I said, when you're raising under the gun +1 shallower stacked against particularly the button, usually your equity is going to be decreased a little bit. All right, let's take a look at 9, 7, 5. All right, 40 big blinds deep. Remember, we're checking 45% of the time or so. 20 big blinds deep, roughly the same. Notice that our equity is roughly the same, right? When your equity is roughly the same, you're going to be using roughly the same strategy. Again, this is a spot where we're under the gun +1 against big blind. The pre-flop ranges have not changed all that much. Therefore, the ranges are going to line up roughly the same. And notice deeper stack, you were mostly betting 2/3 pot. Here it's closer to a 50-50 split. I mean, look, in reality, if you wanted to make your life really easy, I would just tell you to bet using a smaller size across the board when you're playing shallower stacked. And, you know, you'll be messing up a little bit according to GTO, but it's probably fine and it'll make your life a lot easier. That said, whenever you are betting a little bit more polarized in general, you want to be betting using a bigger size, right? Like 9-7-5 definitely favors the under the gun, or favors the big blinds range against under the gun to some extent compared to other boards.
So this is that scenario where you'll see it in cash games a lot. It comes up often where this is a bad board for the pre-flop raiser, but at the same time, it's not like the big blind is going to, as a given, smash this board, right? Like it's good for their range, but you know, 2 pairs, straights, even top pair is not going to happen often enough where this person is going to know with absolute certainty if they should continue. And when you're on 20 big blinds, it can be a very, very, very strong move to, you're raising from under the gun +1. Player defends the big blind, which is kind of standard. You know, you made it 2 big blinds, maybe 2.2, and they're calling because they're getting 3-1 with the blinds and antes. And then the flop comes off like this, and you know, they're going to have some piece of this. But then you bet 2/3 pot, you're going to see the player sit there and really have to think about it because you could just have an overpair, right? You're capping your range, and you could just have an overpair that has their top pair just crushed. Now, if they jam on you, obviously you know it's no good when you're bluffing, but I think it's a more convincing bluff sometimes to bet bigger here, because you're basically, if you had aces here, you would want to bet bigger, or jacks or tens or whatever. You would want to bet bigger because you wouldn't want the next card to come off cheaply, and you'd want your opponent to make a mistake. So if your opponent has something like 6-7 and they've decided that they want to see the next card, betting a third pot's not going to dissuade them. Betting 2/3 pot, they might go, ah shit, maybe I have to make the decision right now to either jam or fold. And you're going to see a lot of people jam the 6-7 here, and when you have the overpair. So that's something to consider. Although, as he said, betting small across the board when your stacked pot ratio is low at 20 big blinds, probably just a good idea. It's not, you know, we're talking about a specific scenario with the 2/3 pot bet. But in a tournament late, especially like if you're nearing the final table, I think just standardizing your C bets and your turn bets to a certain percentage is perfectly fine. Because people aren't going to know. If you never change your bets, they're not going to have any information to go off of. Sometimes you want them to find information, so you're going to change the size of your bets. But other times, you're just going to want them to have to sit there and guess. And when people have to guess, that means they're not 100% confident. If you don't get raised, people aren't confident.
Therefore, when you are betting, you're betting polarized. As you can see, we're checking half the time, right? Therefore, we're betting polarized, best made hands, and then random draws. And when that is the case, you typically bet bigger. All right, button versus big blind. Interesting scenario here. Notice we're actually lacking some of the weaker ace-x in our range and some of these random high cards that don't actually connect all that well with this board. So this range actually lines up a little bit better with the buttons range 20 big blinds deep compared to 40 big blinds deep. So we have a touch more equity.
Because we're jamming those hands pre-flop. That's why they're not in the range.
That said, and because of that, we're going to bet a touch more, right? That said, we're still going to be betting very polarized here, which makes logical sense. We're using mostly a smaller size in this scenario. And like I said, you're usually going to be using smaller sizes. That said, we're still using big sizes some chunk of the time, again, because we're betting mostly polarized. But again, for simplicity, I would just recommend using a small size. Now, under the gun +1 versus button. Same scenario. Like I said, you're usually going to have a little bit less equity when you're shallower stacked, when you raise from early position and the button calls. And that's going to result in you checking a little bit more often, as you see 65% compared to 53% when you have 40 big blinds. But again, when you're betting, you're mostly betting pretty polarized. If you do bet a hand like ace-7 or ace-5 and get raised, you're not folding. If you bet any pair on the board, really, the plan is usually not to fold. And you're betting generally polarized across the board. Like you see, all these mixed frequencies, it's kind of difficult to actually figure out what to do if you are trying to replicate the solver. But again, that's not necessarily the goal. I just want to show you a few of the differences. That said, if you played...
There's an interesting betting pattern here, too, that I want to bring up for a second. So let's say you do have that ace-7 suited, right? You have the ace-7 of spades. The flop comes out like this. You're under the gun +1. You made a raise. The button called it. And then you go ahead and bet 1/3 pot, and the button raises. So if you were to jam all in there and get called, it's a bad scenario, right? It wouldn't be the worst, but it would be a bad scenario. But when you call there and check, and the player then bets, you can continue. You can even jam, depending on what the turn card was. Because players aren't always representing strength, they're just representing your lack of range connectivity. So somebody with a hand like, you know, a backdoor flush draw, or even like 6-7 or something like that, obviously a 9, I don't think raises as frequently as second and third pair because it has so much showdown value. They might just want to just call because they're still, granted, you're under the gun. They don't know if you have an overpair. So then when you bet the flop, and then you bet the turn, you know what I'm saying? They're going to sit there and have to think about it. And then you can set up an actual 20 big blind starting stack that ends up going bet, bet, bet. That works. That you'll get, you know, 8 or 9 big blinds out of this person. And they're going to be by the river on that third bet. They're going to be convinced, shit. You know what I'm saying? My 9-10 is no good here and I got to give it up or I'm out of the fucking tournament. But it's one of those ones where you can't call off, so you don't want to, or you can't jam and feel good about it with the ace-7, but you can call or raise and continue, because when you call the raise and then then you check the turn and the person doesn't bet again, they've told you what's up. You know what I'm saying? Now they're worried about you having an overpair. You get to free showdown to the river, you get to draw to your draws, and then you may be put in a really good bluffing spot, you know? So, just an interesting betting pattern that you should recognize.
The previously outlined strategy where you're betting your best made hands and draws in the spot 40 big blinds deep and do the exact same thing 20 big blinds deep, you're probably going to be fine. Just use a smaller bet size across the board.
Yeah.
All right. Queen, 10, 5, all spades. One of the interesting spots.
My favorite. Monotone boards in tournaments have become such a great moneymaker for me. I love monotone boards. Single suit boards. Just amazing.
As you see here, under the gun against big blind, same story. Equity increases a little bit. Just bet everything using a small size, nice and easy. All right, now button versus.
That was really fast for my favorite thing. The reason why the small size is so effective is because it's impossible to know if the person is holding the nut of that suit. You know what I'm saying? If their person is holding the ace of spades. And if the person's holding the ace of spades, the conventional wisdom, especially at the mid and low stakes, is that they're not going to fold it when they're 20 big blinds deep. They're going to bet a third pot. And even if you jam on them, they're just going to call it because they have way too much equity. They have an overcard and the nut flush draw with one card in their hand. As long as your opponent doesn't have that, you know, ace of spades in their hand on this board, you pretty much get free reign to go ahead and bet. and you're going to get a fold about 80 to 90% of the time. And it is such a moneymaker that I was missing out on for so long, and people still miss it. Even though this information is well known now, people still miss this. About a year and a half, 2 years ago, I started just betting small on all those boards, and god damn it if it doesn't just get the fold every time. It's like a paired board. Paired small card boards are just amazing, because who the fuck's betting that? But at the same time, if the player doesn't have it, they're like, oh, well, this guy's got an overpair. Okay, and they just fold.
Versus big blind. Interesting spot where we have a little bit more equity playing shallower stacked. Therefore, we're going to be betting a little bit more often, right? As you see, 41% 40 big blinds deep, 25% 20 big blinds deep. And that's usually just going to result in you betting more frequently. If we take a look at the hands that are opting to check at this point, it's going to be a lot of hands that don't really want to bet and get jammed, like under pairs, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s. They don't really want to bet and get jammed because they could be good. Hands like jacks doesn't really want to get jammed. King jack doesn't really want to get jammed. King 10 doesn't really want to get jammed. Jack 10 doesn't want to get jammed. These middle pairs don't really want to get jammed, right? The 5s don't want to get jammed. Everything else, though, is opting to bet.
The marginal showdown in good non-nut draws. King jack, is great, but this is a monotone board, so maybe you only have 6 outs, but you may have all 8. You don't know, though. You just don't want to get blasted off of it.
Pretty much any hand that doesn't really mind getting check shoved on because it's either really bad and can easily fold, or it's good enough to call it off. Those are the hands that are opting to bet. And it turns out on this board, because we have such an equity advantage, we're going to be lacking junk to some extent in our range. And when we're lacking a lot of junk, that allows us to bet pretty frequently. All right, 40 big blinds deep, queen 10, 5, all spades. We're doing a lot of checking, 60%, but even more checking out of position. Again, because our equity advantage decreases against the button's calling range, right? This pattern's holding true every single time so far.
On a monotone board, there's less things for your opponent to have that are good. You know what I'm saying? Which is true for you too. So you're seeing more checking because there's less instances where you have really strong situations in your hand. You can see just by here, the hands that get here, aces, you know what I'm saying? Like there's only a quarter combinations that are so strong that you're betting a third of the time. That's the ace with the ace of spades. Then there's a quarter of the time where you have the ace where you don't have the ace of spades, and you're betting bigger. You know what I'm saying? And then you're checking those other combinations. So it's interesting. The ace 5. This is the one you see here where you're betting 2/3 pot. This is the ace 5 without the ace of spades. The ace 5 with the ace of spades, you're only betting a third of the pot, but a very infrequent amount of time, just because you don't want to get blasted off of that ace of spades. Out of position, you kind of want to keep the pot small, try to get your best shot at the equity, and then get it in. And here's the thing, you're going to be check raising a lot in this scenario too, because if you have that ace of spades in your hand, which is in all of your range, you're going to see it where it's just an absolute fucking monster. But a lot of these suited aces here that are checking, or a lot of these ace suited cards that are checking, are the ones that have the nut flush. So you can see where it comes from. And then you're checking hands that have the good showdown. Strong hand like pocket 10s, but it's not great because, it's a flush board. You kind of have to just, figure it out. And if the fourth, of that suit comes off, it's no good. But if the board pairs, you can usually get it all on your full house, things like that. But like jacks with like the jack of spades, it's an easy check because you do have redraw showdown, but what are you redrawing against? You're redrawing against either something that has you beat, like king, queen, or you're drawing against something that you have beat, pocket jacks, that also is holding the, but they're holding the ace of spades. So it's very sketchy, you know what I mean?
It's always important to look for patterns that you can take away from examples, because then you can extrapolate and realize that for the most part, these patterns are generally going to hold true. So out of position, you're going to want to be checking a little bit more often and betting a little bit more polarized.
See, but it's interesting because this is the out of position example, but in the in position example where we get to bet, you can see that the equities versus these scenarios are still 50-50. You know what I'm saying? Because nobody should really smash this off. So the first bettor usually wins. Now, being out of position, it's very hard to be the first bettor and be in a great scenario, so you have to check a lot. But in position, this is why that move works so well.
When you are out of position 20 big blinds deep compared to 40 big blinds deep. So in this scenario, basically always checking. If you wanted to check every time 20 big blinds deep, I would tell you there's no problem with that. When you're betting, they're betting the best made hands and draws pretty much, which, makes a lot of sense. That's what you want to do when you are polarized. All right, Jack 6-6. Here we have 60% betting strategy, 40 big blinds deep. Equity increases a little bit. 20 big blinds deep, therefore betting more often. Also, under the gun +1 against big blind, you can stack off with your overpairs just way more confidently. Like if you have aces, kings, queens on jack 6-6 and they happen to have a 6, like yeah, it's unfortunate. You're not happy about this. But what are you going to do? You're not folding, right? And so for that reason, you can be pretty happy to bet. Notice again that the underpairs to the jack check the vast majority of the time. Also notice pocket 6s now slow plays every time, and pocket jacks now slow plays every time instead of most of the time. And that's because you have the super nuts. When you are shallow stacked and you have the super nuts, remember, one of the things you do more often is you slow play a little bit more often. And that's the case. So notice here, like, you're betting aces and kings and queens, and you may say, why not slow play those? And, you know, to be fair, if you wanted to, I wouldn't hate slow playing aces. But it is still kind of susceptible to being outdrawn a little bit, right? If your opponent's sitting there with, like, pocket 3s and they get a 3 and now lose. That said, the super nuts very often is slow playing. So remember that point we discussed earlier. All right, let's take a look at button versus big blind. Again, equity has increased a little bit. When equity increases a little bit, you're going to be betting a little bit more often normally. But this is another weird corner case. It turns out these low paired boards are kind of interesting whenever you're against the big blind because they have a lot of nuts, right? So this is a spot where even though our equity increases, we're going to be doing a little bit more checking. I think this is the first time we've seen our equity increase when we're shallower stacked, but we're doing more checking. And that's because now we have a lot more of these like random ace-x hands that really don't want to get raised. Let's go back over here to this scenario. Notice we have like lots of we have fewer ace-x hands is what it amounts to. Whenever you have fewer ace-x hands and more just like strong hands like jacks and overpairs that are happy betting, you should be more inclined to bet. But notice here we have a lot of hands that are likely to be good at the showdown, all these ace-x, but really don't want to bet and get raised. Like right here, if we have, let's say, ace-3. Ace-3 is probably good if it checks down, but we really don't want to get raised off of it. When we're playing deeper stacked, you don't really care if you get raised off of it quite as much. So interesting spot here. This is a bit of a corner case where we have 60% equity compared to 57%, but we are checking much more often. Again, due to lacking the nut advantage because we don't have a whole lot of 6s, right? I mean, we have some, but not compared to the big blind. Big blind has like all the 6s here. You're going to find that when you min-raise button, big blind's going to call very, very frequently, so they have lots and lots of nuts here. And when they have lots and lots of nuts, you have to be a little bit more cautious when it comes to betting. Notice here, aces and kings do opt to slow play at this point. And when I say slow play, like here, you're really just checking to protect your checking range so that you can easily call a turn and river bet with a larger portion of your range. But when you are looking to slow play, you want to be looking to slow play / include the best hands in your range that are not susceptible to being outdrawn. So as you see, aces, kings, jacks, of course, 6s, of course. Even then, some 6s are opting to check just to protect the checking range. So you have lots of these king highs. Notice these king highs are mostly checking back and hoping to win at the showdown. You're just going to check down king, queen, right? Because if you're on the button against the big blind, check, and you show king high on the river, it's probably good. So because you have a lot of ace high and king high in this scenario, compared to under the gun +1, notice we have just more like overpairs and strong jacks and whatnot. That allows us to bet more often when we are under the gun compared to the button. And it's kind of interesting. When you're going through all these examples, I realize they may be kind of like blending together for you. Take this slow, go through them, and try to see what changes. And ask yourself, does that make logical sense? Why does it make logical sense for our equity increase, but we're checking more often? And again, it's because even though we have the best hand a lot of the time with stuff like king, queen, we completely lack the nut advantage, right? And we really don't want to be getting check raised off of king, queen, or ace 9 in this scenario. So that results in us checking it more often as we get shallower. So try to use a little bit of logic and sort of extrapolate to see what changes. All right, here we are under the gun +1 against button. We were betting more often when we were under the gun +1, 40 big blinds deep compared to 20 big blinds deep. Again, this same pattern is basically always going to hold true. When you're under the gun +1 against a reasonable button calling range, you're just going to have substantially less equity. When you have less equity, you're going to do a lot more checking. In this spot, if you told me you wanted to check 100% of the time, I would have no problem with that. That's going to help protect your checking range as well, which you really want to strengthen here because it's a lot of like various ace high and king high type hands. So this is a pretty reasonable spot to check very, very often, perhaps 100%. All right, let's take a look at a few more examples. King, king, 6. Under the gun +1 against big blind, bet everything, right? Nothing really changes besides, well, smaller size is used in general in both examples. But again, not much changes at all in this spot. Let's take a look. Button versus big blind. Remember, we were betting close to 100%, 40 big blinds deep. But now, even though equity increases a little bit, we have a lot of hands we don't really want to get check raised off of. Again, so kind of a neat spot, similar to that Jack 6-6 board. This is a spot where if you told me you wanted to bet 100% of the time, again, I'd have no problem with that. But notice that we do have some hands that really don't want to get check raised, like Queen Jack. If we check down with Queen Jack, button versus big blind, we probably win. Ace 7, Ace 5, right? Same story. Also notice again, nut hand slow play, right? The super nuts are slow playing basically every time shallow stacked. So cool spot, another spot where our equity increases a little bit, but we're still doing...
The bigger paired board's not as great to bet because it's just so less likely that somebody's going to bet the king, and that is the current meta. Now, if you're up against an aggressive player who can be tricky, who likes to float a lot, who likes to, pull moves, I really like betting these boards when I have it. It's a very rare thing, but I really like betting these boards just on a regular c-bet and then checking the turn. You're just going to find them putting in a big bet, which is usually going to make for the rest of their stack on the turn or river. It's going to be pretty interesting, but understand once they bet, the jig is up. So you're trying to get them to bet as big as possible. You can take as much time as you want, but they're probably going to have to actually have something, and they're going to have like a pair. So like if you're up against a guy who likes to make moves but also has like pocket 10s or 9s or even like a 6, then yeah. Obviously pocket jacks or something like that might just call you down, but I think it's a good deal to just like bet small quite often, and you're going to see those move makers do that. Now that being said, it's also a good spot to check when you don't have it, and then when it goes check, check, flop, betting small in the turn, people go, he's trying to trap me with a king, and then you just get the fold. So understand the dynamic of the big paired boards. Any 2 cards, jack or higher, you're going to be in an interesting situation. And there's a lot of manipulation you can have with that, and a lot of exploitable scenarios.
A little bit more checking, but again, like 6% checking, just bet everything. 16% checking, it's probably fine to bet everything. So I wouldn't put too much stock in this, and I wouldn't think, oh man, I need to be checking a lot more on king, king, 6. Because in reality, I don't think you need to. If you do want to check some hands though, check some nut hands, like pocket kings, pocket 6s, and then check hands that very easily could win at the showdown that can also call a turn bet, like ace highs and whatnot. All right, let's take a look at under the gun +1 against button. Again, equity decreases just a little bit, which is going to result in us checking a little bit more. But again, this is the one of the rare spots from out of position where you should continuation bet 100% of the time, and you're going to be perfectly fine. And that's just because you have all the good kings in your range. All right, let's take a look at 7-4-3. This is a board that's particularly good for the big blind, right? So now we have one of these rare instances where our equity actually does not increase much. It's basically the same, 40 big blinds deep compared to 20 big blinds deep, under the gun +1 against the button. Notice in both scenarios we're doing roughly the same amount of checking, a little bit more checking when we are shallower stacked. Again, that's because you don't want to bet and get raised as often. Like say I have a hand like a6, right? Very clear draw when you're deeper stacked. You can actually bet this and perhaps call a raise when you're deeper stacked. But shallow stacked, if we bet a6 and get check shoved on, it's really, really bad, right? So you're going to find that the draws that really don't want to get check shoved, those are very, very often opting to check. We've seen that pattern hold true a few times so far going through these examples. Stuff like king, queen, hand that you can bet and then fold it when you're playing deeper stacked. Now you don't really want to bet and fold it because if it checks down, you very easily could win. That's something you definitely want to be asking yourself in these scenarios. If I check it down, could I reasonably win? And quite often, ace highs and king highs prefer to check it back a little bit more often, playing shallower stacked, and that forces you to not bluff quite as much or bet quite as much in general. That said, roughly the same strategies in these spots, but when you are betting, you're using a smaller size. So again, I realize these strategies are a little bit different, but I would not really play them all that differently, especially if you're trying to make your strategy simple. Now, button versus big blind. Interesting spot. Equities are roughly the same, but we're doing a whole lot more checking again when we are playing shallower stack because, again, we don't want to get check raised as often. So when you're shallower stack, whenever your equity decreases or is roughly the same, you're usually going to be checking just a little bit more often. And often with the hands that are opting to check are going to be the ace-high type hands that have decent showdown value. Like, look, pretty much across the board in all of these examples, if you've been paying attention, like ace-9 here, right? It's numbers are tiny. It's betting, well, it's checking 68% of the time, playing 40 big blinds deep, and it's checking 85% of the time, playing 20 big blinds deep. So just checking a little bit more across the board. Remember, when you're using very mixed strategies, I'm telling you, don't get too bogged down in this and think, oh my God, I have to memorize this, because you don't. Just take away general patterns. Like, all right, whenever we are shallower stacked, we're going to be checking a little bit more often with hands that really want to check it down and see the showdown. That's going to mainly be ace highs and king highs to some extent.
Right.
But that said, you're still betting your best made hands in your draws. And I would have a betting range here. I see we're checking 70%, betting 30, and you may think, oh, well, maybe we should just start checking everything. But nah. You definitely want to bet these hands in red. Anytime you see some decently large chunk of your range just betting every time, and that range is pretty obvious and easy to find. Like right here, look, all the sevens and all the overpairs are betting, right? You're going to want to be doing that. And then the draws are draws that don't want to get check raised. Remember, when you're betting with a shallow stack, you really don't want to be betting draws that...
It's an interesting scenario here, too, where I'm more likely to bet bigger with the overpair here than I am with the improved pair. So like the ace-7, I'm more likely to bet small than I am with the, pocket jacks. Just because of the fact that, like I'm betting pocket jacks bigger because I'm capping my range at one pair. But here's the thing. When we're capping our range at one pair and we have top pair here, we're basically betting smaller because when we get raised, we are usually in a very, very, very good scenario because the other player is typically betting something that the board helped him, improve. So if a player has 8-7 and we get check raised, we're going to get it in, and the amount of times players are just going to donk it off with one pair there. Now, can they have two pairs? Can they have 5-6s? Sure. But you'd be surprised, and it's better to have the 7 in your hand because, like, let's say, there are even scenarios where somebody has 3-4. Now you have extra draws on the turn for board pairs. You don't have to hit trips or the ace. If it comes out of 5 and it comes out 5-5, you now beat 4-3. You know what I'm saying? But it's interesting because having jacks, we're capped at one pair that pretty much can't be improved by the board, which means we're not sharing it. So if we get jammed on, right, we're either completely crushing the opponent, but they're going to have equity against us, or they're just going to have us crushed, and we're going to have to draw out, and it's going to be less likely of a scenario that we're sharing outs. Like if somebody has ace-4 and they decide to jam on us when we have ace-7, it's better than when we have jacks because they have fewer outs against us. Now I know you're saying like, but jacks are just stronger than 4s. This is true, but it doesn't matter. We've already got them pipped with a pair, but ace-4 is drawing dead pretty much versus ace-7. Ace-4 has 2 outs, whereas pocket jacks versus ace-4, it has 5 outs, which is 20%. Wow. Hang on a sec, guys. Sorry. Ended up having to fix my cup there. So it's it's an interesting scenario where you end up in scenarios where players can check jam, certain hands, but you're in better shape with a weaker hand overall than you are with the overpair. So just an interesting betting pattern thing I think should be recognized.
Have lots of equity but don't want to get check shoved. So notice we're betting stuff like Jack 8 suited, Queen 8 suited, Jack 9 suited, Queen 10 offsuit, Jack 9 offsuit, right? The very, very junky draws. So where if you bet and get jammed, you're happy to fold. And then if you bet and get jammed with 7 or an overpair, then you're clearly calling it off.
Right.
All right. Let's take a look at one more spot. Here we have under the gun +1 against button. This is the out of position scenario. In both instances, we're doing a whole lot of checking. And again, I realize we're checking even more deeper stacked. That's because when we're shallower stacked, we can just more confidently get it all in with our ace-7. Like if you're playing 40 big blinds deep, you don't especially want to bet and get it in with a hand like ace-7 or overpairs. I mean, you're willing to, it's fine, but you're not thrilled about it. Whereas when you're shallower stacked, you're essentially reverse implied odds where you're losing a lot of money when you're beat are mitigated because you're shallow stacked. So you're usually happier just getting it in with what is likely the best hand immediately, and that's going to result in you betting a little bit more often in this spot. But again, roughly the same strategy across the board. So as you can see in this scenario, you definitely want to ask, does my equity increase or decrease? Very common takeaway we're seeing here is that when you're out of position against a button caller, your equity usually goes down a little bit. Not always, but a little bit. And when that's the case, you should be checking more often out of position for the most part, but not always, especially if you have a lot of hands that want protection, like in this example. I know it's hard to come up with some very clear and fast rules that really dictate exactly what you should be doing in this spot. And I know people want clear and exact rules, but it is hard to give those. But if we go back here to the general differences, remember, sometimes ranges are going to change significantly, right? Sometimes not so much. And essentially this results in equities being slightly different, 40 big blinds deep compared to 20 big blinds deep. Sizes would be smaller for the most part. We saw that pretty much across the board, but with similar frequencies, right? For the most part, you are betting relatively similar frequencies, sometimes doing a decent amount more checking, usually when the equity advantage went up a lot or down a lot, depending on the scenario. We didn't exactly discuss bet sizing here because we're not necessarily talking about turn and river yet. We're going to get to facing bets in a little bit when we discuss how to play as the pre-flop caller. But then also, your premium hands slow play more often. We definitely saw that across the board. So these are some key takeaways, and hopefully these examples illustrated that a little bit.
Interesting. But yeah, and it's funny because we were nearing the end of this section, and I was like, man, this fucking test is going to be rough. This is one of those ones I would really suggest downloading after I post it, and you're going to have to go through this a few times. Like, I've been through this section before, and it is very dense. But again, it's more so the reinforcement of things we already know, right? Like, these examples are just there to understand how ranges interact with certain boards. And once you understand that, it's like everybody starts out, okay, what are the rules of the game? Cool. The first thing people go to then when they want to get better is pre-flop charts. What do I pre-flop for every position? Or what are the hands I should play? Then you start thinking about my position. You go, okay, well, this position here does this. This position there does that. Cool. Then we're moving on to the flop. Okay, I should c-bet the flop when I have these hands. Why? Blah, 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 blah. Then we get into, well, when the board is this, you can c-bet these more specifically. So it kind of all stacks and builds on each other. So don't be intimidated by this kind of stuff, and understand you're looking for general implementable strategies. When things say, bet 2/3 of the pot 5% of the time, bet 1/3 of the pot 8% of the time, just fucking pick one. Like, it really doesn't matter. It can come down to a specific scenario if you're going to bet. But usually in those scenarios, like you said, you can just check 100% of the time and you're not making that big of a mistake. Because the total amounts you're betting is like 13% of the time. You could give that up to make your life easier. So it's implementable strategies that matter. And just remember, all this information will stack in your mind over time, so it doesn't have to be so intimidating. I'm surprised. It happens all the time when I'll be looking at something in the morning, and then at night I'll be like, ooh, I saw this morning, and I'll be able to pull the move or do whatever. And you don't even make a point of like learning it at the time. It's just in there. So I always think the best way to learn is to throw a million things at yourself 100 million times over. And about the 100 millionth time you hear it, you're going to get them all. But the first time you may only get one or two little things. But knowledge stacks, so don't be intimidated by this stuff. Let's check out the quiz. When you're 20 big blinds deep under the gun +1 versus the big blind on this board, should you bet your entire range? Not your entire range, but it's close. Yeah. You got a huge range advantage here. I mean, this is one of those default ones where it's like 85-90% of the time, so your entire range you can just bet. This board's just so good for the under the gun raiser. 20 big blinds deep on the button, when you're on the button, versus the big blind, should you ever bet with a large sizing? Not really. Wrong, really. Okay, I see. So it's protection versus the, okay. Many hands that want to have a large bet sizing, hands like King Jack, things like that aren't like the monster strength, but definitely want to protect their hand versus spade draws. So middling kings, middling suited kings with the jack, or without the jack is good. King Jack, things like that. Obviously, 2 spade hands can bet smaller. Betting larger, I guess, with the Ace Queens, Ace Tens, Ace Kings, things like that. Ace Jack, obviously checking. So, all right, it's early. I read the hand wrong. Under the gun +1 as the pre-flop raiser out of position against the button. Should you bet with your entire range? Well, I don't think so. Yeah. Because out of position isn't a spot. It's a spot you're going to be doing a lot of checking because you're out of position. It's just a general rule. Across almost all flops, should you check a little more or often when you're out of position as a pre-flop raiser when 20 big blinds deep or 40 big blinds deep? 20, right? Yeah. Because your stack to pot ratio is lower, so you're going to be checking your bad hands and your good hands because you're going to be check raising more often because you want to get the money in. It's not the case with 40 blinds. You're on the button facing the big blind, or on the button facing the big blind. The flop is Jack 6-6, 20 big blinds deep. What should you do with Jack Jack? It's the super nuts. It's not even like Ace Jack, which is really strong here. I mean, that's the super nuts. You just check it. You're on the button versus the big blind, and this is the board, 20 big blinds deep. Which hand types would you want to use a big bet sizing with the most? I'm going to say the overpairs. You can do it with the Ace 7s and stuff like that, but I'm thinking the overpairs. Yeah. Strong, but you're capped. Like, if you had the Ace 7, you'd want to bet smaller, right? Because you're going to be sharing that Ace. You know what I'm saying? You're going to be sharing that 7, too. So it's going to be a good scenario for you. Under the gun +1 versus the big blind. Okay. All right. So we're out of position. Or we're in position. On 7-4-3, 20 big blinds deep. Should you mostly use a large or a small c-bet size? I mean, the narrative is that we have an overpair, but we can pretty much 20 big blinds just default to a small size, I think. Yeah. It's one of those ones where because the big blind is going to improve a lot here, we don't want to overcommit. If you wanted to go for the bluff from a player who you know will fold everything except top pair, then yeah, the larger size. But that's too specific. Also, again, I think we can just default to a smaller size when we have a smaller stack. It's kind of an easy rule of thumb, you know? So yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think it's fine. All right, that marks this. We're going to mark this as complete. And as soon as this updates, come on. I always find that around 1 o'clock people are using the site more, so it kind of... Okay, so next section is as the preflop caller out of position. Okay, so with a preflop caller out of position, facing a bet. So this is like we're in the big blind, we defended, and now we're out of position, and we checked, and somebody bet. Okay, cool. Or somebody under the gun raised, and we're... yeah, I guess we're in the big blind. Or I guess we could be like raising in the low jack, and then the cutoff calls, and maybe we check and they bet, you know, that kind of thing. It's only a 2-minute section. I wanted to end it, but you know what? Let's do the section. Okay.
Now let's discuss as the preflop caller out of position when you are facing a bet. And as always, you're going to want to use the bet response flowchart. In basically every scenario, when you're facing a bet, use the bet response flowchart. So to be very clear, someone raises, you call out of position, you check, they bet. With your junk, just fold. Just fold. With your marginal hands, you're usually going to want to be doing a lot of calling. And with your premium made hands and draws, you want to ask, do you have the nut advantage? If the answer is no, you're going to want to be doing a little bit more calling. And if you do, you want to be doing a little bit more raising. Now, when we are raising, when shallower stacked, as you see this little exception down here, we're going to be wanting to go all in more often. This is going to be especially true with our strong but vulnerable hands. And one other thing you're also going to see is that with some of our marginal hands that don't mind protection, like some middle pairs, they're often going to consider just jamming it all in as well. Okay?
This is that check raising out of position more often scenario.
That's because when we're out of position, we're going to have a tough time protecting our hand, realizing our equity fully if we call. But if we shove, we just essentially get to cash out whatever equity we have, and we get to make our opponent fold out some hands that have equity. So you are going to force your opponent to potentially make some errors whenever you do jam. Now, as the pre-flop caller in position, same logic generally applies, except you're going to be doing more calling in general. And that's because your equity realization is going to be higher when you are in position. So really, not a ton is going to change compared to playing 40 big blinds deep in these scenarios. Besides, you are going to opt to shove all in a little bit more often with hands that do not mind making their opponent fold, that are likely best, right? Like say you do have a hand like ace 10 on ace jack 5. That's a spot where when you are 40 big blinds deep or deeper stacked, if you're facing a bet in position or out of position, you're basically always just going to call. But if we are playing deeper stacked or shallower stacked, that hand is probably good. Ace 10 is probably good on ace jack 10. So if you do get it all in, you don't love it. Your opponent's going to call off with any weaker ace, maybe even some jacks. So you could very easily get called by worse hands. And also you make it impossible to get outdrawn, and you also make it impossible for you to check call flop. Turn comes, some bad card. It goes check, check, river. You have the best hand, you bet and they fold, or you check and they check. Or if it comes off two bad cards, you check, they bet, and you fold, and sometimes they're going to be bluffing you, right? So in general, across the board, with your hands that are probably best that don't mind protection, we are going to be jamming it in. But realize, compared to out of position, you definitely do want to stick around more often, because the idea of minimum defense frequency in position definitely does still apply even when playing shallow stacked. But out of position, minimum defense frequency does not really apply at all.
It's one of those interesting things where you kind of have to ask yourself, if I check raise jam here and get called, what calls me that I'm happy about? And usually it's like top pairs, things like that, when you have top pairs and stuff versus draws. But there are a lot of scenarios where you are better off raising, but I think it's too broad of a topic to really get into until you get into the higher stakes, so we're not even going to bother with it. When you're choosing a non-all-in raise size, should you use a smaller or larger raise when you're deep stacked? Well, larger. Oh, wait a minute. When you're deep stacked. Oh, then when you're deep stacked. Missed then. Smaller, yeah, because you have a lower stack to pot ratio, you don't have to raise as much. Duh. Should you defend less than the minimum defense frequency in position and short stacked? No. Yeah. You're going to do more of the minimum defense frequency in position generally. Okay. Mark that as complete. We're going to go back to the lesson. I guess mark it as complete first, right? I think it's already marked. I've been through this section before, so come on. I mean, if the next section's that short, we may just bang through it. I feel okay. I'm a little tired, but and I do want to play a lot today. Yeah, this is a good long section we'll stop on. As the preflop caller facing a bet examples. These examples are tough. So we're going to go back to the lesson now, and we'll see where we're at. This is a very deep section because obviously this is where the most money is made in tournaments. So this is kind of the stuff you want to study the most, So we've gone through 3 sections in about an hour and a half, and we've still got 6 more to go. So it's going to take us a while, and we'll probably only get through these 2 tomorrow. But yeah, I'm liking this section. I think it's all good stuff. And again, this is stuff that you can just stack up in your mind, and you'll just pick up little things here and there. You're going to have to go through these sections a lot of times. But this is important stuff. This is where you make the most money. All right. I'm going to call it here. I'm going to be back pretty shortly, probably about 2, maybe 3 at the latest, which is about 45 minutes to an hour and a half, to come back and play some cash games a lot today, most likely. I'll see you guys later. I'm not going to rage you out. Have a great night.